Generosity isn't a virtue for people who can afford it. It's a choice made by people who can't. And when that choice costs everything, it stops being kind and becomes something closer to reckless. Unless, of course, the universe has been waiting for exactly this moment to finally balance its scales. If a story like this, where kindness meets its match in fortune, speaks to something inside you, subscribe now. There's more coming and you won't want to miss it. The coffee shop on the corner of Kongnam and 5th had been serving the same bitter Americano for 12 years, which was exactly how long Minji had been working there. Not managing it, working it. 6 days a week, 4 in the morning to midnight, her hands perpetually smelling like espresso and desperation. She'd taken the job when she was 19, fresh from a mother who'd spent her final years apologizing for being sick, and a father who'd disappeared the moment the medical bills started arriving. 19 years old with a high school diploma, and a talent for noticing the small ways people struggled. The coffee shop owner, a woman named Lee Soo-hyang who'd inherited the business from her own mother, and treated it with the particular reverence of someone managing a sacred trust, had hired Minji on a Tuesday without asking about her background. All she'd needed to know was there in the way Minji's eyes tracked the room, calculating who might be short on rent, who might skip lunch to save money, who might need an extra shot of espresso because sleep had become negotiable. Soo-hyang had been that person once. She understood the mathematics of barely surviving. They'd made an arrangement. Minji would work, and in exchange, she'd have a place to sleep in the back room and 1 free meal a day. It wasn't charity. Soo-hyang was clear about that. It was business. Minji was reliable and precise, which made her valuable. The fact that she was also slowly starving to death was, in Soo-hyang's calculation, not her problem to solve. But problems have a way of solving themselves if you're patient enough to wait. 8 years into working the coffee shop, Minji had saved enough money to rent a small room in a boarding house in Jongnyo-gu. It wasn't much. A window that looked out onto an alley where other people's lives happened, while she watched from her rectangular view of the world. But it was hers. She paid the rent in cash on the 1st of every month, and the landlord, a man who asked no questions and demanded no explanations, accepted her money and left her alone, which was the most generous thing anyone had ever done. The coffee shop was still her primary address though. She opened it at 3 in the morning before the sun had any right to be awake, and turned on the machines one by one. The grinder, the espresso maker, the milk steamer. Each one coming to life like she was conducting an orchestra of machinery that existed only to serve people who had somewhere to be at 6 in the morning. The first customer was always the same. A businessman who ordered an Americano with 1 sugar, and never made eye contact. He came in at 4:15 every day, paid exact change, and left a newspaper behind like it was an accident. Minji read it during her breaks. That's how she kept up with the world. Through discarded newspapers and overheard conversations between people who belonged to the kind of reality she observed from the margins. 13 years of this. 13 years of watching other people's lives happen at a speed she couldn't quite match. She'd watched people get engaged in corner booths. She'd watched them cry into their coffee when things fell apart. She'd watched them celebrate promotions and mourn losses, and live entire emotional narratives across the space of a cappuccino. And she'd stood behind the counter, consistently present, consistently invisible, her own life on pause while she served the ones who were actually living theirs. It was during the 14th year that everything started to crack. Soo-hyang had a stroke on a Tuesday. Just like that. One moment she was counting the till, and the next moment she was on the floor, her body having made an executive decision that her mind hadn't approved yet. Minji had called the ambulance and then sat in the hospital waiting room, which smelled like bleach and inevitability, while doctors delivered news in the particular tone reserved for bad outcomes. She'd recovered mostly, but the coffee shop was closed while she underwent physiotherapy. And Minji, who'd built her entire existence around the architecture of that job, found herself suddenly unemployed and evaporating. 3 months without income is a long time when you're living in a room so small, you can touch both walls if you stretch. 3 months of watching your savings dwindle with the particular clarity of someone doing mathematics they didn't want to do. 3 months of rationing meals down to 1 a day, then half a meal, then coffee with extra sugar pretending it was lunch. By the 4th month she'd stopped pretending. She'd stopped a lot of things. Pretending she'd be okay. Pretending the world was fair. Pretending that hard work and kindness eventually accumulated into something resembling a life. Soo-hyang had finally reopened the coffee shop in the 5th month, but the woman who returned wasn't quite the same. Something had shifted behind her eyes. Something that made her look at Minji with a new calculation, like she was trying to figure out what Minji was worth now that her own mortality had been made suddenly violently clear. "I can't pay what I paid before," Soo-hyang said. "The business needs to rebuild. I can give you minimum wage and benefits." Minji took it because the alternative was mathematics she couldn't survive. Minimum wage. No housing. Just the room in the boarding house and the increasing sense that she was playing a game everyone else had already finished. It was on one of these mornings, opening the coffee shop at 3 a.m. in the dark of early Seoul, that she found him. The beggar was wedged between the coffee shop's back door and the dumpster, wearing clothes that had started as one color and had evolved into a palette of stains and time. His hair was long in the way that suggested nobody bothered to tell him it was acceptable to cut it. His face obscured by a beard so deliberately unkempt that it looked like a choice rather than neglect. He was sleeping with the particular completeness of someone who'd forgotten what wakefulness felt like. Minji should have called the police. The building owner would have wanted her to. Instead, she went inside, made a cup of coffee exactly the way Soo-hyang had taught her, and brought it back out. The man woke slowly, like consciousness was a country he was visiting and wasn't sure he wanted to stay. His eyes, when they finally focused, were the color of winter. Not cold. Winter. The specific quality of light that arrives when everything else has gone still. He looked at the coffee like she'd offered him something far more valuable than caffeine. "You didn't have to do that," he said. His voice was rough in the way that suggested it hadn't been used much recently. "You don't have to be hungry," she said. "Doesn't make much difference, does it?" "Does," she said. She meant it. She sat down on the concrete beside him, which was a choice that would cost her everything and save her everything, and was the single most important decision she'd ever made without understanding its weight. He drank the coffee slowly, like he was trying to memorize the taste. "What's your name?" "Minji," she said. "Minji," he repeated, like he was learning a language. "I'm Kejun." She should have asked why he was sleeping behind a coffee shop. She should have asked what sequence of decisions had led a man with eyes like winter to live in the space between garbage and concrete. She didn't ask because some questions are mercy in reverse. "You're kind," he said when he finished the coffee. "No," she said. "I'm just familiar with the mathematics." He looked at her then in a way that suggested he was seeing something most people missed. "Most people miss it," he said. "They see generosity and assume it comes from fullness. But it doesn't. Real generosity comes from people who understand what it means to have nothing. You gave me your last coffee." Minji didn't deny it. There wasn't much point. He'd seen what she'd been trying not to say out loud. That her paycheck had arrived 2 days early, and would stretch until the next one if she was careful. That careful meant coffee was a luxury she'd stopped allowing herself. That she'd gone to the back room, made that cup of coffee, and chosen to give it away anyway. Because someone else's hunger was more visible than her own. "That's not kindness," she said. "That's just math." "Maybe they're the same thing," he said. She should have been afraid. A man sleeping behind a dumpster should have inspired caution. Instead, she felt like she'd been waiting her entire life to meet someone who understood that generosity and survival weren't mutually exclusive. They were just expressions of the same desperation. She started leaving him food, carefully. Not in a way that would get her fired, but in a way that acknowledged his presence. Pastries that hadn't sold. Eggs that were about to expire. Coffee he never had to ask for because she started making it without being prompted. He appeared every morning at the same time, like he'd synchronized his schedule to hers, though she never explicitly invited him to. He'd sit behind the shop and read the newspaper she left out for him, and sometimes he'd make observations about the world that suggested he'd lived a different life than the one currently taking place in that alley. "You're educated," she said one morning. He looked up from the business section. "What makes you say that?" "The way you read the news. You're not just consuming information. You're critiquing it." He smiled. It was a small smile, The kind that suggested smiling had become unfamiliar. I was once. Everyone is educated about something, he said. What about you? You're educated about survival. That's rarer than you think. For 3 weeks this was her life. Work. Beggar. Sleep. The particular architecture of barely enough, made bearable by the presence of someone who understood its geometry. He never asked her for money, never suggested she owed him anything, just accepted the food she brought and the conversation that was becoming increasingly natural, and returned each morning like he was keeping a promise she hadn't made him keep. On a Thursday morning, near the end of the 4th week, she found herself doing something that she'd been avoiding admitting she would do. She took the money from her rent envelope. Just a portion. Just enough to take him to a bathhouse. She didn't frame it as charity. She framed it as practical. You can't keep coming here like this. People will notice. He didn't argue. He didn't thank her either, which somehow made it matter more. Just accepted her logic and her money and disappeared for 4 hours. When he returned, his hair was cut. His beard was gone. He was wearing clothes she didn't recognize as his own. And his face, the face she'd only glimpsed beneath neglect and time, was the kind of beautiful that made her understand why people wrote poetry. He looked like someone had forgotten to finish him, like every line had been drawn with intention but left incomplete, waiting for some final detail that would make the picture make sense. He looked at her looking at him and said nothing, which was the right choice because speech would have only gotten in the way. I gave you my last money, she said. Not my last. She still had enough for food. Maybe not for next month's rent. Maybe not for the small room in the boarding house that had become her only proof that she existed as something other than a function. But not her last. He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Something that suggested he was seeing her for the first time with complete clarity. Not as a kind woman. Not as a generous stranger. As someone who had less than he did and had given anyway. Do you know what that makes you? He asked. Stupid, she said. No, he said. Rare. K-June started coming to the coffee shop during business hours after that. Not as a customer. Not exactly. He'd sit in the corner booth, the one with the view of the street and the exit, and he'd watch. Not her exactly. Though she felt observed in a way that made her hyper-aware of every movement, every word, every choice. He watched the way she worked. The way she moved between customers with an efficiency that came from practice and exhaustion. The way she remembered orders without writing them down. The way she gave people slightly larger portions when she thought Soo-hyang wasn't looking. The way she never once complained about the fact that her life had become a series of transactions designed to keep her alive rather than let her live. Soo-hyang noticed him immediately. A clean man in a corner booth who ordered nothing and left no mess was the kind of efficiency that made business owners nervous. She pulled Minji aside one morning while K-June was in the bathroom. Who is that? Soo-hyang asked. Her eyes had that calculation in them again. The one that suggested she was running numbers. Friend, Minji said. You don't have friends. Soo-hyang said it not unkindly, just factually. You work and you go home and you work again. There's no space in that schedule for friendship. Minji didn't argue. Soo-hyang wasn't wrong. Friendship required time and energy and belief that tomorrow was worth investing in. She had none of those things. If he's going to sit here, he needs to buy something, Soo-hyang said. This isn't a shelter. Minji understood the subtext. This also isn't charity, which meant Minji couldn't be running one either. Not on Soo-hyang's clock and Soo-hyang's coffee and Soo-hyang's carefully calculated margins. I'll tell him, Minji said. She did. That afternoon when K-June arrived, she told him he needed to order something or he couldn't stay. He ordered an Americano and a pastry and never complained about either. He just paid in cash, left a generous tip that made Soo-hyang's eyes narrow with fresh calculation, and continued observing. What are you looking for? Minji asked one afternoon when they were alone. The shop was closed. It was 2 in the morning. He'd started waiting outside until she finished her closing duties, and she'd started inviting him in because pretending she wasn't waiting for him to be there was exhausting. Evidence, he said. Of what? That you mean what you say. That the kindness isn't performance. That it costs you something real. Why does that matter? He looked at her then with an intensity that suggested he was trying to solve a mathematical problem, using only the contents of her face. "Because I'm trying to understand something," he said. "And you're the first person in a very long time who's made me believe understanding is possible." Minji didn't ask what he was trying to understand. Some questions have answers that change everything, and she wasn't sure she wanted her life to change. Change required moving, and she'd spent so long standing still that movement felt dangerous. "Tell me about the rent," he said instead. "What about it? You gave me money for the bathhouse. That was rent money, wasn't it?" "Yes. How much do you have left?" She didn't want to answer. The answer was humiliating. The answer was 9 days until she had to make a choice between eating and having a place to sleep. The answer was that she was doing the math she'd been avoiding. "Enough," she said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving." He didn't push. He just stood there in the fluorescent light of a closed coffee shop at 2 in the morning and looked at her like she was a painting he was trying to understand. Like there was something there worth understanding. "Would you take my help?" he asked. "No." "Why not?" "Because help from people you don't know comes with conditions. Because I've spent my entire life watching people owe favors to people who did them kindness. Because I don't want to be indebted to you or anyone else." He nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. What if the help didn't come with conditions? "It always does." "Not always," he said. "Sometimes people help because they can. Not because they want something in return. Not because they need to be thanked. Just because the alternative is unacceptable." Minji didn't believe him. She'd seen enough of the world to understand that kindness was currency. People spent it expecting return on investment. But she wanted to believe him so badly that it hurt. So she didn't argue. She just went back to wiping down the espresso machine and pretended she hadn't heard what he said. He came back the next morning at 3 a.m. like always. But this time he brought newspapers. Not the kind she found abandoned. The kind that costs money. He stacked them on the counter and asked her to read him the business section while she made coffee. She did, haltingly at first, then with increasing confidence. The business section was full of names and numbers. Mergers and acquisitions. Companies being bought and sold like they were pieces on a game board. One name appeared frequently. Kejun Corporation. A conglomerate so massive that its influence touched everything from logistics to real estate to technology. She didn't put the pieces together immediately. It took reading the same name 7 times before her brain caught up with what her eyes were telling her. "Kejun Corporation," she said slowly. "Yes, that's your name." "It is. You own that company." "I did." Past tense. "I walked away." "Why?" She looked up from the newspaper. He was watching her with that particular intensity again. "Because I was building an empire and losing myself in the process," he said. "Because success looked like being unable to recognize the person you become. Because I had everything and nothing simultaneously. And then one morning I woke up and decided I didn't want to be that person anymore." "So you became a beggar." "Not quite. I became free. Beggar was just the costume that made it believable." Minji set the newspaper down. The numbers on the page suddenly didn't matter. The acquisitions and the quarterly reports and the projections all seemed like they were written in a language that had nothing to do with actual living. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm testing my theory," he said. "What theory?" "That when people are kind without knowing there's anything in it for them, their kindness means something. Real kindness comes from choosing generosity when you can't afford it. Not from choosing it because you can afford to be generous with money. You gave me your last coffee when you couldn't afford that coffee. That's not kindness. That's rare. That's the thing I've been looking for." "What are you looking for?" "Someone who hasn't been corrupted by having everything. Someone who knows how to give without expecting return. Someone who understands that the value of money isn't what it can buy you, but what it costs you to give away." Minji understood then that her life was about to change. Not because she'd done anything to invite the change, but because someone had been looking for her specifically, had orchestrated an entire test, had deliberately put himself in a position of need to see if she would respond with genuine kindness or calculated charity. She'd passed apparently. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends," he said. "What do you want to happen?" She thought about her small room in the boarding house. She thought about the coffee shop in Suhyang and the mathematics of barely surviving. She thought about 13 years of standing still and watching other people's lives. She thought about what it meant to be chosen, not for what she could provide, but for who she was. I want my life to mean something, she said. I want to matter. You already do, he said. The question is whether you're willing to let someone help you understand that. She should have been suspicious. She should have asked questions. She should have recognized that this was a setup. A rich man testing a poor woman. A person of power evaluating a person without any. Instead, she said yes. He helped her give notice to Suhyang the next day. 2 weeks' notice, professional and clean. Suhyang didn't ask questions. She just recalculated her numbers and found someone else to fill the gap that Minji would leave behind. That's what the world did with people like Minji. Replaced them. Moved on. But Kejun didn't move on. He waited those 2 weeks. Came in every morning. Sat in the corner booth. Watched her work. And on the final day, when she locked up the coffee shop for the last time, he was waiting outside with a car that cost more than she'd made in her entire life. Get in, he said. Where are we going? Somewhere you can build the life you deserve. She got in. Not because she trusted him, though she was beginning to, but because the alternative was stepping back into the mathematics of barely surviving, and she'd finally decided that wasn't enough. As the car pulled away from the coffee shop that had been her entire world, she looked back at the window where she'd spent 13 years being invisible. The window where she'd watched other people live while her own life accumulated dust. She didn't know yet that Kejun would put her through one more test. A test that would force her to choose between her own survival and someone else's. A test that would prove whether her kindness had limits. A test that would change everything again. The apartment was on the 73rd floor of a building so tall, it seemed designed to separate the people inside from the people on the ground. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Seoul in a way that made the city look like a circuit board of lights. A landscape of human existence reduced to points of electricity. Minji had never been this high above the world. She'd never had a view that stretched for miles. She'd never had a space where she could walk in any direction without hitting a wall that wasn't hers. Kejun gave her a key and told her the apartment was hers. Not borrowed. Not temporary. Hers. She could bring whatever she wanted to it. Change whatever she wanted about it. Live however she wanted to live. The only condition was that she never lied to him about why she made the choices she made. I won't lie, she said. People say that, he replied. Then circumstances test them and they break their promises. I won't break mine. He studied her for a moment, then nodded like he'd made a decision. We'll see. The first month was adaptation. Learning how to exist in a space that was hers without constantly feeling like she was trespassing. Learning how to order food from restaurants instead of preparing it herself. Learning that money could exist in quantities she'd never imagined, and that having it didn't immediately solve the problem she'd been solving manually for so long. Her body took time to adjust. She'd been running on minimal sleep and minimal food for so long that given comfort, her system didn't know what to do with it. She slept for 14 hours straight on the first night. Her body was claiming what her mind had deprived it of. Kejun gave her access to his company, not as an employee, as an observer. He wanted her to understand what he'd built, what he'd walked away from, the empire that had required him to become someone he no longer recognized. The offices of Kejun Corporation occupied 15 floors of a building that had its own zip code. The architecture was designed to communicate power. Everything was minimalist and expensive. Everything was made of materials that had been chosen because they cost more than most people's houses. The staff moved with a particular deference of people who understood that their employment was contingent on their invisibility. Minji watched. She observed the way power operated when you had enough of it to demand silence. The way people's eyes shifted when Kejun entered a room. The way conversations stopped and then resumed at a different frequency, one calibrated to his presence. He introduced her to his board of directors, a collection of men in their 60s who'd spent their lives accumulating money and had forgotten what it was for. They looked at her like she was a decoration he'd acquired. Pretty, purposeless, temporary. This is Minji, he said. She'll be sitting in on all major decisions moving forward. She'll have voting rights equal to any board member. The silence that followed suggested they'd all been briefly unable to process what they'd heard. You're giving voting rights to a woman with no business experience, one of them finally said. I'm giving voting rights to someone whose value isn't measured in her resume, Kejun replied. This company has been run by people who look like you for 30 years. That's why it's corrupted. Minji felt the weight of that decision. Sitting in a boardroom where she didn't belong, holding power that felt like fraud. For the first few meetings she said nothing. Just listened and tried to understand the language they were speaking. The language of profit margins and market penetration and shareholder value. It was during the fourth meeting that she finally spoke. You're building a product that makes people's lives harder and calling it innovation, she said. She was looking at a proposal for an app that would automate customer service, which meant it would eliminate the jobs of approximately 3,000 people. That's the point of innovation, one of the board members said with the patience of a man explaining basic economics to someone simple. You optimize by removing inefficiency. People are inefficient. People are the point, Minji said. You're treating them like they're obstacles to profit. But they're the reason profit matters. The room was quiet. Kejun was watching her with that particular expression. The one that suggested she was being tested again. What do you propose instead, he asked. Retrain them. Invest in education programs. Move them to different divisions. If you're going to eliminate a job, you have a responsibility to the person who had that job. That's expensive, someone said. Yes, Minji replied. But less expensive than the cost of having 3,000 people who can't afford your products anymore. Kejun smiled. Small. Precise. Like she'd answered a question correctly on an examination. She started attending every meeting after that. Started asking questions that made people uncomfortable. Started suggesting that profit didn't have to come at the cost of people's survival. Started proposing that maybe, just maybe, a company could make money and still treat the people who worked there like they mattered. Some of the board members fought her. Some of them quit. But gradually, the company's direction shifted. Healthcare benefits expanded. Wage floors increased. Education programs launched. The quarterly profits dropped, but the long-term stability increased. People stopped leaving in droves. People started staying because they felt valued. It was after 3 months that Kejun presented her with the real test. We have a problem, he said. One of my oldest friends, someone I've trusted for 20 years, has been embezzling money. Not small amounts. Millions. Built up over years through shell accounts and fraudulent transactions. Minji felt the weight of what he was about to ask. He has a family. 2 children. A wife who doesn't know anything about what he's been doing. If I turn him over to the authorities, his family loses everything. If I don't, the company continues to bleed. Other employees' pensions are affected. People whose only retirement plan depends on this company's stability lose their future. What do you want me to do? Minji asked. I want to know what you would choose. If you were me. She understood the test. This was about whether her kindness extended to people who didn't deserve it. Whether she'd choose compassion over justice. Whether she'd be corrupted by having power in the way that powerful people usually were. She thought about the beggar in the alley. She thought about the coffee shop. She thought about the mathematics of barely surviving and how easily it became the mathematics of causing others to barely survive. Turn him in, she said. Kejun's expression didn't change. His family will suffer, he said. Yes, she said. But he chose that. He knew the risk and he made the choice anyway. And now other people are suffering because of it. You have a responsibility to the 3,000 employees whose pensions depend on the stability of this company. You can't sacrifice their futures to protect someone who chose to betray you. What would you do if he was your father? Kejun asked. If turning him in meant your family lost everything. Minji was quiet for a long moment. She thought about her own father. About the way he disappeared when her mother got sick instead of staying to help carry the weight. About the way his choice had consequences that extended far beyond his own life. I'd turn him in, she said. Because staying silent would mean I valued his comfort more than I valued integrity. And integrity is the only currency that actually matters. Kejun nodded slowly. He picked up his phone and made a call. Within an hour, investigators were reviewing the accounts. Within a day, his oldest friend was being questioned. Within a week, the embezzlement was public and the legal proceedings had begun. The board members who remained were shocked by Minji's recommendation. They'd expected her to choose mercy, to use her newfound power to protect someone, to become corrupted the way all-powerful people eventually did. She didn't. And in not becoming corrupted, she proved something that Kejun had been testing since the moment he met her under the bridge. That kindness without integrity is just performance. That real generosity requires making hard choices. That a person of value doesn't compromise their principles when circumstances change. A week after the embezzlement became public, Kejun called Minji into his private office. The view from 73 stories high spread out behind him like a map of the city below. "I want you to run the company," he said. "Why?" "Because you understand something most people with power forget. That power is just responsibility dressed up in expensive clothes. That leading means serving the people who follow you. That success measured in money is just success measured in the wrong currency." "I don't know how to run a company," Minji said. "You know how to be fair. You know how to think about consequences. You know how to choose integrity when it costs you something. That's all you need to know." She took the position. And in the months that followed, she transformed the company from a profit machine into something closer to an institution. Wages increased. Working conditions improved. Education programs expanded. And somehow, mysteriously, the profits didn't decrease. They just started going to different places. To the people who actually created the value instead of being hoarded by the people who'd inherited control. Minji's picture appeared in business magazines. From Beggar to CEO. The woman who changed everything. Kindness as corporate strategy. She hated the headlines. They made her story sound like luck. Like she'd been randomly chosen by a rich man and rewarded for being nice. They didn't mention the 13 years in the coffee shop. They didn't mention the choices she'd made that had cost her. They didn't mention that kindness without consequence is just charity. And charity isn't the same as transformation. But Kejun understood. And that was enough. One evening, walking through the city with him, they passed the coffee shop. It looked smaller than she remembered. The window where she'd stood for 13 years was dark. "Do you miss it?" Kejun asked. "No," she said. "But I'm grateful for it." "Why?" "Because it taught me that survival and kindness aren't contradictory. That you can be both desperate and generous. That the world doesn't have to be divided into people with power and people without. That maybe, if we're lucky, we can build something better." He took her hand, not romantically, just as acknowledgement, as recognition that they both walked into that alley wounded, and they both walked out changed. She didn't know yet that the real test was still coming, that there would be one more moment where everything she'd built would be threatened. One more choice that would determine what kind of person she actually was. One more question that would force her to decide between security and principle. 6 months into her position as CEO, Minji discovered that Kejun had lied to her. Not dramatically, not in a way that was meant to hurt her, but a lie nonetheless, and lies have a way of unraveling everything they touch. She found the documents in his private safe, a safe she'd opened looking for company files, and instead found evidence of a completely separate operation running parallel to the legitimate business. An operation that used the company's logistics network to move products through channels that weren't entirely legal. Not drugs, but close. Medical supplies diverted from hospitals. Technology rerouted from government contracts. Money flowing in directions that didn't appear on any official ledger. The operation made approximately $50 million a year, and Kejun had been running it since before he met her. She sat in his office with the documents spread across his desk and waited for him to return from his afternoon meeting. Her hands were shaking, not from anger, from betrayal, because she thought she understood him. She thought that his choice to walk away from the empire meant he'd actually changed, that the beggar under the bridge was the real version of Kejun, and the billionaire was the performance. She'd been wrong. He entered the office and saw the documents before he saw her. His expression shifted immediately. Not guilty, just resigned, like he'd been waiting for this moment and had finally arrived. "How long?" she asked. "Since the beginning," he said. "Since before I became a beggar. Since before I put on that costume and tested your kindness." "Why?" Because I needed to know if you'd corrupt if you had access to the machinery of corruption. Because I needed to see if giving you power would turn you into the kind of person who'd rationalize anything for profit. This was all a test. All of it. The coffee shop was real. The beggar was real. My feelings for you were real. But yes, the endgame was always a test. I wanted to build a legitimate company, but I needed to understand if the person running it would actually stay legitimate when circumstances got complicated. Minji felt something inside her break. Not her trust. She'd already learned not to trust completely, but her hope. The hope that there was a version of power that didn't require compromise, that you could have everything and still be good, that the universe could be fair if you were willing to pay the price. I need to turn you in, she said. I know. If I do, the company collapses. The transformation we've worked on stops. The people we've helped suffer because the continuity is disrupted. I know. You're asking me to choose between justice and mercy again. And you're hoping I'll choose differently this time. I'm not asking anything, Kejun said. I'm telling you the situation. What you do with it is your choice. That's the real test. Not whether you'll be corrupt with power, but whether you'll use power to protect the people you care about, even if it costs you your integrity. She understood then what he'd been building toward. He'd created a scenario where her kindness and her integrity would be forced into conflict, where saving the company meant protecting him, where protecting him meant becoming the kind of person who rationalized corruption for a greater good. She called the investigators that night. Not the authorities. Not yet. But the people who'd handled the embezzlement case. People she trusted to understand the nuance of what she was reporting. They came with warrants at dawn. Kejun didn't resist. He let himself be arrested with the same calm he'd shown when she first found him in the alley. Like he'd always known this was where the story would end. The company's stock dropped 40% in the first hour of trading after the news broke. Board members panicked. Employees worried about their jobs. The transformation she'd built started to crumble under the weight of the revelation that the man who'd funded it had been committing crimes the entire time. Minji called an emergency board meeting. She stood in front of the assembled directors and told them the truth. The company's foundation is compromised. Kejun built this legitimate operation on top of an illegitimate one. That was wrong. But the work we've done here, the transformation we've created, that's real. The wage increases are real. The education programs are real. The people we've helped are real. So what are you proposing? One of them asked. We separate. We take the legitimate business, all of its assets and operations, and we move forward independently. We leave Kejun's compromised empire behind. We become something new. That means we're walking away from billions of dollars in assets, someone said. Yes, that means we're essentially destroying what he built. No, we're saving what we built. There's a difference. It took 3 months to unwind the company. 3 months of legal battles and negotiations, and the slow work of extracting the legitimate from the corrupted. In the end, they emerged with a company worth a fraction of what it had been, but untainted. A company that could move forward without the weight of Kejun's crimes hanging over it. Minji visited him in prison once. She didn't know why. She'd convinced herself she was done with him. That what she'd felt in the alley was an illusion created by her own desperation for connection. But looking at him through the thick glass partition, she realized the truth was more complicated. You were right, she said. About everything. You built a test and I failed. I was willing to compromise my integrity to protect you. No, he said. You called the investigators. You reported me. You failed the test by refusing to fail the test. That was the point. I don't understand. You were willing to let me go to prison rather than become corrupt. That's not failure. That's the only success that matters. I wanted to know if you choose your integrity over me, over the company, over everything you built. And you did. Cost you everything. Cost me what needed to be taken away. I've spent my whole life accumulating things. It took someone like you to show me that the only thing worth keeping is your character. And you kept yours. She didn't visit him again after that. But she made sure his trial was fair. Made sure he wasn't mistreated in prison. Made sure that justice was served without cruelty. That was the last kindness she gave him. And it came from a place of forgiveness rather than love. The company thrived without him. With Minji at the helm, it became something that had never existed before. A for-profit business that treated profit as a means to an end rather than the end itself. Money was made, but it was distributed. Wealth was created, but it was shared. Success was measured not just in financial returns but in the lives improved, the community strengthened, the people who could finally breathe without the mathematics of barely surviving. 3 years later, Minji stood in a coffee shop. Not the one where she'd spent 13 years. A new one. One she'd opened with the profits from the company. A place where anyone could come, regardless of their circumstances. Where the coffee was good and the pastries were fresh and nobody was ever turned away. She ran it the way Soohyang had run the original. Not as charity, as business. Because she understood that sustainability required profit. But profit that served something larger than itself. A woman came in one morning. Thin. Desperate. Doing the mathematics that Minji recognized because she'd been doing the same math her entire life. She ordered the cheapest coffee and sat in the corner, nursing it like it was medicine. Minji made her a pastry. Not because it was free, because it mattered. She brought it to the woman's table without being asked. "You don't have to do that," the woman said. "I know. But generosity isn't about what we have to do. It's about what we choose to do when choosing costs us something real." The woman looked at her, and Minji saw herself reflected back. The person she'd been. The person who was still struggling to understand that the world could be different if you were willing to pay the price to make it different. "What's your name?" Minji asked. "Jiwoo." Minji wrote her address on a napkin. A small room in a building she owned. Furnished. Waiting. "I have a job available if you're interested. It's not permanent. Just until you figure out what comes next." "Why would you do that?" "Because someone did it for me once. And because paying kindness forward is the only way to make sure it doesn't disappear from the world." Jiwoo took the napkin. In that moment, the cycle continued. The way it had started with Kjun and Minji. It would continue with Minji and Jiwoo and everyone who came after. A chain of generosity stretching backward and forward through time. The last time Minji saw Kjun was at his parole hearing. 10 years had passed. He'd spent them in prison doing the work he should have done in freedom. Education programs. Teaching other inmates. Choosing consequence over escape. When he was released, he didn't try to contact her. He didn't try to rebuild what they'd had. He just quietly disappeared into the world and built a small life helping people who didn't have anywhere else to go. Minji heard about it through mutual acquaintances. A man running shelters in Busan. A man who understood that redemption wasn't about returning to what you'd been, but about becoming something better. She was proud of him. Not in a romantic way. In the way you're proud of someone who's learned the most important lesson life has to teach. That power isn't measured in money or control. That the only empire worth building is the one you build inside yourself. Years later, when Minji was older, when her company had grown into something that touched thousands of lives, when she'd become exactly the kind of person the world needed, she thought about that morning under the bridge. About a man sleeping in an alley who deliberately tested her character to see if it would survive contact with power. She understood then what he'd been trying to teach her. That kindness isn't a virtue for people who can afford it. It's a choice made by people who understand that everything costs something, and the price of integrity is the only price worth paying. She'd paid it. And in paying it, she discovered something that neither of them could have predicted under that bridge in the cold. That generosity and justice aren't mutually exclusive. That you can transform the world and remain yourself. That the only real wealth is the wealth of a clear conscience. Drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever been tested by someone who was trying to understand your character? Have you ever chosen integrity over comfort? Because that's the choice that separates people who merely have power from people who actually deserve it. Like this video, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to remember that kindness is strength. Only people who think character doesn't matter won't hit subscribe.